it's Mo. It is September 8th, and I have read 5 books so far in September, so it's definitely time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I talk about the books that I've read in order that I've read them, as close to when I've read them as I can, and I try to talk for about 5 minutes about the book. I tell you something about the book, I tell you whether I like the book, I tell you if I think you should read the book, whether I recommend the book. The first book that I finished in September was Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. In September, it is Shorty September, which is one of my favorite readathons. I love readathons where you read short books throughout the month, and there's some great prompts, and I will leave the creators of Shorty September listed down below as well as the prompts. So a lot of the books that I'm reading in September are shorties, but Carrie Soto is Back is not a shorty. I started this book in August. I found this book in August in a little free library, and this is a continuation of the Taylor Jenkins Reid universe that also contains the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Malibu Rising and Daisy Jones and the Six. I've read several of those books, and Carrie Soto plays a small part in Malibu Rising, and I was super interested to read her story because I think her character in that book is very interesting, and the way that she's described is very interesting. So I was super happy to find this one, and I picked it up almost immediately because I have been wanting to read it for several years. Carrie Soto is Back is about Carrie Soto, and mostly it's about her relationship with her dad because her mother died when she was quite young. Carrie's dad, Javier, is a tennis star, and he comes to America, meets a woman, falls in love, has Carrie, and decides kind of for Carrie that Carrie is going to be the greatest tennis player in the world. And when her mother dies, she really throws herself into this role. She takes to tennis early, and she wants to be a tennis star, but when her mother dies, she finds that tennis is the connection that she has with her father and to the rest of the world. So Carrie is not a very likable person a lot of times because she's striving so hard to be a winner and to be the best at tennis. So a lot of this book is about Carrie's childhood and young adulthood into tennis stardom, and then the other part of this book is about Carrie Soto returning to tennis after she has retired, and after she has won all these records and everything, she decides to retire, partly because of injuries, partly because she's kind of accomplished things, but when she retires she figures out that her life isn't as fulfilled without tennis, and she doesn't want to see her records get broken by other people. Then we go on the journey of Carrie coming back to tennis and how she trains and strives to once again be the best tennis player in the world. So this book is a lot about tennis, if you couldn't guess. I personally don't care about tennis. I have never really gotten into watching tennis. Some of my friends watch tennis. Since I lived for a very long time in Brooklyn, a lot of my friends went to the US Open, which is in Queens, very close to Brooklyn, but I've never watched a tennis game. I've never been interested in tennis. And this book didn't necessarily endear me to tennis, but it did give me the information about tennis that I needed to maybe want to watch a tennis game. I didn't really understand the rules before, and I still don't really understand the rules, but it definitely made me more interested in the thought process and the thinking side of tennis, and how it is very much about skill and agility of body, but it also very much about skill of mind. And this book is a lot about that. This book has a ton of tennis in it. So every match that Carrie does when she comes back is described in detail. There's the points, there's the thought process, there's her opponents. Everything is very detailed. So if you hate tennis for some reason, you might not like this book. If you are indifferent to tennis the way I was, you might not like this book, but I ended up enjoying it, and I think Carrie is an interesting character to follow because of the hang-ups that she has, even from childhood and certainly into adulthood. And I think something that a lot of people will be able to relate to with Carrie is her drive, her ambition, and her kind of a lack of anything else when it comes to tennis, lack of ideas of her outside life and ideas of her outside world and fulfillment in other areas of her life, and it's a good kind of allegory for perfectionism and productivity, burnout, and so all that kind of stuff. So I think even if you are not into tennis, you can get something out of this book or relate to Carrie in some way in this book. I really enjoyed this. I did think it was a little like obvious surface level as far as some of the relationships and some of the twists or events that happen in this book. Like right from the beginning of the book, you knew certain things were going to happen, and when certain characters are introduced, you know certain things are going to happen. There was like a brief moment where I thought that there would be a twist or a different storyline and where we would see a different relationship than the one that ends up happening in this book, and I got super excited that that might be the case, but no, it was not the case. It was the obvious relationship. It was the obvious outcome of relationships. It wasn't that deep in those respects. One of the great things about Taylor Jenkins Reid writing, though, is that it's just super compelling. It's just super bingeable, super readable. You just want to keep reading what these characters are doing, even if they're doing the obvious things. So super glad to have read this one. The next book that I read in September, I also saw and immediately read, and that was The Full Moon Coffee Shop by Mai Mochizuki. This is a Japanese translated work, and I think this is the debut in America work of this author. It came out in August 2014. I saw it as an audiobook in the library, and I immediately put it on hold so that I could read it. The Full Moon Coffee Shop is in the vein of Before the Coffee Get Cold and the Food Detective one. Very much books about messages, lessons to be learned, ways of living, life lessons that you could get, and done in a like cute, quirky way. In the Full Moon Coffee Shop, it has a lot to do with astrology and your astrological sign, your birth chart, and all the things that make up the different seasons and ages of your life, and how they are going to affect the choices that you make, and how you can use astrology and the knowledge of your natal chart and the knowledge of your signs to react to the different things that happen in your life to improve your life and learn life lessons. We start with a woman who was a substitute primary school teacher. She was a teacher and she loved teaching, but because she was a substitute, she never had her own classroom. But on the side, she was also a screenwriter and a scriptwriter, so she decided to pursue that. Now we're catching up with her later in life. She's recently had a breakup, and her scripts are not getting picked up, her work is not getting the acclaim, and she's kind of scraping by. She stumbles upon the Full Moon Coffee Shop, where there are very interesting owners and workers at this Full Moon Coffee Shop, and where they explain to her her natal chart and her astrology signs, and how the lessons that she could learn from these signs will help her improve her life. And then we hear from another person who has a similar experience, and then we hear from another person. I enjoyed Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I thought it was sweet. I'm pretty sure I teared up at it. I liked it. I didn't love it the way that other people love it. I thought it was fine. I thought it was interesting. I'm not continuing on with that series. I think the subtle differences between this and that are, I enjoyed the writing more in the Full Moon Coffee Shop, and I enjoyed the quirky characters more in the Full Moon Coffee Shop. And I like the inclusion of astrology, because I do like books that include astrology. If you're looking for a very short, sweet book about life lessons, and you don't find those to be like smarmy or annoying, because I think they definitely can be, I would definitely highly suggest this one, especially if you like things that are a little quirky or that have astrology in them. For Shorty September, I used the Full Moon Coffee Shop for Summer Cookout Shorts, which is read a book and then cook something that goes with it. So I definitely ate dumplings or scallion pancakes or something Japanese inspired during the time of reading it. The next book that I finished in September is Just Out of Jupiter's Reach, which is a short story which comes free with one of my subscriptions. This is by Nnedi Okorafor. I like Nnedi Okorafor. I have read one other short story, and and one novella by her before. I really enjoy her work, especially her kind of sci-fi. I mean, I guess it's all sci-fi that she writes, her sci-fi work, and how it is always connected in some way to Nigeria and Nigerian myth and African myth. Just Out of Jupiter's Reach is about a older woman who decides to, well, is she older? She's not young, but she decides to take part in this government-issued program where people are sent into space. They're going to be gone for 10 years. When they come back, they're going to have enough money to help their family or do basically whatever they want for the rest of their life. So our protagonist decides to participate in this program. She gets chosen to participate, and at year 5, after 5 years of living seemingly alone in space, but not quite alone, she meets up with the other participants of this program, and this story really revolves around the 3 or 4 days that they are together. That's all I'm going to say about this one because it is very short. The thing that I love about these short stories, besides getting to read authors that I love, besides getting to test out authors that I haven't read from before, is when a story hits like this one. Such a short story. They're usually about an hour and 15 minutes on audiobook, obviously shorter if you're reading them at a faster speed, but they hit suspense, shock, horror sometimes, relationships, connections, like everything that you want from a book, and this is why I love short books in general, in a very short package, and this is definitely one of those stories. I really loved the connections that were made. I liked our main character and the connections she made with her ship and other things, and then also there was like shocking moments, there was suspenseful moments, there were angering moments. There is animal violence in this, just a teeny tiny bit, which is not cool and I don't like, but I think it was used to an interesting effect in this, and I don't think it was done purely for shock value, but it was more done to illustrate some of the mindsets of some of the characters that we meet in this story. So again, one of those short stories that makes you want to keep reading those short stories, makes you want to keep reading short stories in general. The next short story that I read in September, likewise, was excellent, I thought, and that was We Travel the Spaceways by Victor Laval. It is another one of those short stories that I got in a subscription that I have, and the real reason that I don't get rid of that subscription. We Travel the Spaceways is the second Victor Laval that I've read, and I really, really enjoyed this one. And same, I think this had suspense, it had interest, it had interesting characters, it had character development, it had interesting development of relationships, it had queerness, which the other story did as well, which I didn't mention. It also draws from the idea of kind of myths and legends or histories of people in a small way, like Just Out of Jupiter's Reach did. This one is about a man who is living in New York. He is unhomed, he is homeless, and he is kind of wandering around when we first meet him looking for food. He's sitting outside of a bodega, he gets chased away, the police are threatened to be called, and he doesn't want that kind of attention at all. So he flees the bodega, and we see him picking up a bag full of bottles and cans, and we see the special relationship that he has with bottles and cans, with these particular bottles and cans. And also we find out one of the reasons that he really does not want to tangle with the police, besides obviously being a black man, besides obviously being homeless, besides obviously being someone who people would consider mentally ill. So that is the very basic premise of the story, and I'm not going to tell you more because you really need to read this very, very short story to find out what happens. But I will say that our main character, who other people call Grimace, but that is not his name and he doesn't like that name, meets a person who he can finally connect with. So again, this was just such an interesting story. You don't know where it's going at first, and then it all ties together at the end, and I really, really enjoyed it. I liked The Ballad of Black Tom, which is the other book by Victor Laval that I've read. I really did enjoy that one. But maybe because that one was based on an existing story, or maybe because that one was earlier in Victor Laval's career, it didn't feel as tight as this story does. I really liked Ballad of Black Tom, and I think it is really good, and especially if you've you've read the horror Red Hook, it is definitely worth checking out. But I would also check out We Travel the Spaceways if you have the availability. The fifth book that I have read so far in September is YN by Esther Yee. This is another one that I've had this book for several years, but as soon as I saw it come up on audio on my library, I snatched it up. And I'm really glad that I did, because this is a tough one to get through. I know a lot of people do not like this book, and I see, or at least I think I see, why they don't like this book. It's told in a very fever dream, stream of consciousness, existential way that I could see a lot of people really not liking. The story is pretty simple. Our main character, who I don't remember her name, maybe she's unnamed, but our main character is a woman of Korean descent who is living in Germany. She's like a normal 30-something woman. She has a life, she has a career, she has a roommate, and this roommate is obsessed with a boy band, which, funnily enough, all have names of the planets and constellations and stars. So it ties in with the Full Moon Coffee Shop in the astrological references a lot of times. The main character's roommate drags her to see a concert, and our main character is initially completely blasé about this. She's like, yeah, I've heard their music, it's fine, whatever. But when she goes to see them live in concert, she makes a mental connection on her own with one of the boy band members called Moon, and she becomes completely and irrationally obsessed with Moon and with the idea of Moon and with the existential idea of loving a person, loving an idea, loving an icon, and she goes on kind of a grand adventure, eventually ending up in Korea to seek Moon out. While she's becoming obsessed with Moon and with this boy band to a certain extent, the boy band announces that they're not going to be performing for a while, and then announce that they're coming back, but coming back without Moon. So this drives our main character completely over the edge, and again, she goes on this grand adventure. So this one was really interesting. Earlier this year, I read Idle Burning, which follows a lot of similar themes, although in that we're dealing with a very young character who sees loving this K-pop band, well, that's a J-pop band in that one, loving this J-pop band and specifically one of its main members to abstraction as a way to deal with her lack of enthusiasm about life, lack of enthusiasm about her life, lack of understanding in how life works and how to deal with life due to like her own personal issues. So in Idle Burning, it's much more about the realities of obsession and the idea of how people can be obsessed with something outside of themselves to compensate for things that they can't handle inside of themselves. Whereas YN, like I said, is an absolute fever dream, an existential crisis / awakening of ideas of just what obsession means and how it can completely change your perspective, how it can completely change the way that you look at life. And it's told in like an extremely outlandish way. It is told in a very like stream of consciousness way. So, you know, things don't necessarily make sense because it's constantly like flowing, and our main character gets into situations that obviously are not realistic, but are they her interpretation of what's going on? Are they obsession? Are they something else? So very interesting. I actually really enjoyed this. It took me a while to get into because of the way that it was written, but by the end, and once I got into the flow of it, once I got over my expectations of what books should be and what a book like this should be, having read a book similar to this not long ago, I ended up really enjoying it. It's very wild, it's very nebulous, it's very over the top, but I really liked it. I read this one for Rockstar Shorts, which is to read a book and then to pair it with music, either an album or a song. So I found a list of like the 100 best K-pop songs over the last 20 years or 25 years, and I just listened to a bunch of those when I was done. Some of them I enjoyed, some of them I didn't. I don't think I'm ever going to be like a huge K-pop fan, but I definitely see the appeal, and I definitely see the appeal of books like this dealing with K-pop or J-pop, and also I see why people who are obsessed with K-pop might not like this one. But like I said, I really enjoyed it. So those are the first 5 books that I've read so far. And when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is September 11th, and I have finished 4 more books in September so far. So the next book that I finished in September was The Goblin Market and Other Poems by Christina Rossetti. I've been reading this one for a while. I started this one in August, and it is a book of poetry by the English author Christina Rossetti. Her father was a Dante scholar, and he encouraged her to write and to write poetry, and she is most well known for her poem The Goblin Market, which is like 10 pages long. It's not like super long poem, but it's definitely longer than your standard poetry. She was also well known for writing sonnets and for writing like devotional poems about or for God or for Jesus. She was extremely religious, and that comes across in her writing a lot. I didn't love this one. I read it partly because The Goblin Market plays a large part in the Wayward Children series, or the idea of goblin markets, and supposedly this is one of the first places that was really noted, and the idea of portal worlds. I'm not really counting this as a portal world book, even though that one poem does have a portal world. The vast majority of this book is her other poems. So I didn't love this one. I thought The Goblin Market was interesting. Obviously, you could read a lot into a lot of her poetry, but also it felt very surface level in a lot of ways, and it felt kind of obvious. Like when she was trying to obscure different notions, it seemed kind of obvious. I ended up tabbing a lot more in the back of the book than in the front of the book, and I'm not sure if this collection is in chronological order, but it certainly felt like it was. It felt like the later poems in this book were later poems that she wrote, and it felt like she came into her own in poetry a little bit more. I think the initial poetries and I think the Goblin Market is a little clunky. Like the rhyming stances and the rhyming rhythms of this feel very clunky to me, and therefore make a lot of the poems difficult to read. I also think like the God factor makes this a little bit difficult to read, just because you're kind of waiting for every poem to be about God or to be about Jesus, and you know, those just aren't like my favorite types of poems. I felt that way when I initially read Louise Gluck too, the first Louise Gluck book that I read, but I reread that one like immediately after finishing it, so I read the poems and then I went back and read them again, and I ended up not feeling as strongly about that in her work. So I wonder if I reread some of Rossetti's poems, I would have the same reaction, where I wouldn't feel as strongly opposed to the God poems, the poems about religion and about spirituality and about religious spirituality. It seems pretty obvious that she had a very traumatic romance in the beginning of her life, and that like marred her for life from ever finding love again. And it definitely seems like from reading her poetry and the little bit of biography that we get on her in this book, that romance did not work out, and she always felt bad about it, and she always felt, you know, maybe there was something bad about it. Maybe she was groomed, or maybe she was raped, or maybe she was sexually assaulted. It's like unclear what happened, but it seems like that like had an effect on the rest of her entire life, and she never fell in love again, and she never fully expressed love except to Jesus and God. Definitely worth the read, a classic for sure. Very interesting. I'm definitely going to be keeping this copy and probably rereading some of this poetry, and ideally I would like to reread The Goblin Market, but I think I'd like to see like a couple of videos on it or hear other people talk about it before I reread it. The next book that I finished in September is 2043, A Mermaid I Should Turn to Be by Nisi Shawl. This is a short story that I get for free in one of my subscriptions. I've never read any Nisi Shaw, but apparently she's well known for creating diverse spaces in writing and for writing young adult novels, sci-fi fantasy novels, and short stories. This one I didn't think was very good though. 2043, A Merman I Should Turn to Be is about a man turning into a merman, and the idea is that he is in a band, and it's far enough in the future where they've decided that the niche market that they want to target is under the sea. So he and his entire band, all his bandmates, are turning into mermaids and going under the water. It's unclear whether it's Earth or not. I guess it is Earth because there's a lot of talk of like reparations and race equality and inequality, but it felt very, very jumbled. The different ideas felt very jumbled, and the way that the underwater world was described was hard to understand, hard to picture, so it didn't flow well in my mind. And I don't know if there was really like a point or a plot to this story. It was okay, but definitely not my favorite of these stories. The next short story that I read in September was also from this subscription, Void by Veronica Roth, and I really, really enjoyed that one. I've only read 2 stories now by Veronica Roth. Both of them were from this subscription. Both of them were very short stories, and I thought they were both excellent. So much detail, so much character development, so much interest, so much world building in such a short amount of time, and in such a concise and approachable way. Void is about a young woman who has taken a job on a long-haul spaceship. So on this ship, time is different, and this voyage takes many, many, many years. So although she's only in her early 20s, according to the outside world, she's probably decades old, if not older. She likes this life on this spaceship, but she sees people come and go on this spaceship, either working in the custodial department like she does, or as passengers. One day she is called to a passenger's cabin, and she kind of makes friends with this passenger very quickly after she's done the repairs to his cabin. So she's totally surprised the next day when this passenger is found murdered. So this is a murder mystery. It's a little bit longer than a lot of these stories. It's about an hour and a half, but if you read it on 1.75 speed, which is why I did, it goes super quickly. It has everything. Like I said, character development, world building, character backplot. Like, you learn so much about not only each person's character, but also their history, their future, their ideas. And then on top of this, it has a really compelling mystery that's super interesting. So I really love this one. It's probably in my top tier of those little short stories. The next book that I read in September was A Year in Japan by Kate T. Williamson. This is a book that I've had for a long time. It is a non-fiction graphic travelogue. So it is about Kate Williamson doing a year in Japan. She went to Japan on like a gardener's grant that she got to spend a year in Japan just observing Japanese culture and Japanese weather and the different plant life and everything that goes on in Japan. And this is just her kind of brief notes, little bits of observations that she's had, and her very simple, very lovely pictures of her time in Japan. And I really like this one. It was in my basement box books, which is fun. I've had this one for a very long time, so I was glad that I put it in the basement and then I brought it up from the basement, and now I've read it and it can go on my red shelf. And when I read some more, I will let you know. It is September 21st, and I have read 7 more books so far in September. I'm reading quite a few books. I think Shorty September is definitely helping with that. The next book that I finished in September was Elsewhere by Alexis Shaikin. This book is a sci-fi in the vein of John Wyndham or K. Dick. It takes place where there is an isolated town that has certain traditions that kind of throw back to times before. So the world is the world kind of pretty much as we know it, But in this specific town, time seems to be moving slightly differently. There's different traditions, there's different ideas, there's different physical things that happen. And our main character, Vera, is a little girl when we start this book. This is her story of growing up in those traditions in that town and seeing how this isolated town affects its town members with the different traditions and with the different ideas of reality. So this town is extremely isolated. Vera's family runs a photography shop, and it's one of the few like businesses like that that still exist in this town, because when businesses close down or when people stop having those businesses, they become obsolete or they get taken over by something else, and then the people are forced to do that activity through a person who comes into the town like with trade and with domestic goods and things like that. So for instance, when people can no longer get their photographs developed at this photography studio, they will be forced to use the outside forces, send their photography away. Same with certain things that are imported into the town. A man comes, you make a list of all the things you want, and the next time he comes, the next week or whatever, he imports those things again. So it's very isolated, it's very out of date. And then on top of that is this kind of sci-fi element of their traditions. I don't really want to say more than that because this is a very short book, and I think that finding out the different aspects of this book is what is kind of exciting. Like, I went into this book really not knowing anything about it, or at least like very, very little, and I really appreciated that. This book is very much about the mood and the atmosphere and the experience of Vera as she's growing up, as we're learning more about this town, as we're learning more about her life and who she is as a person, and the different things that transpire either in this town or on the edges of this town. Everyone else is from elsewhere. So this town is kind of the center of Vera's universe, and then everything else is elsewhere, which is the title of the book. I really, really liked this one. I thought it was very much in the vein of John Wyndham. It felt very much in some ways like The Chrysalids, and even to a certain extent like Day of the Triffids, in that it felt very out of time. Like you weren't exactly sure where or when this took place, and you were very easily brought into the world and how the world worked, but because it was different than our world, it was interesting to see those developments and see them through the eyes of our main character. It felt a lot like They by Kay Dick, in that there is this kind of vague, ominous feeling, not a dread feeling, which is that feeling that I don't like in books, but a vague, ominous feeling of you as the reader and Vera as the main character having to learn the repercussions and the implications of the world, why the world is the way it is, and specifically why this town is the way it is. Definitely highly recommend this one. It's interesting because this one is one of Sarah from Freshly Read Books' favorite books, and I think she would really, really like John Wyndham, and I think she would really, really like They by Kay Dick, because they both feel very, very much like this. I also read Elsewhere for a Savage Prompts vlog, so if you want to see more of my thoughts, you can check out that vlog when it's out. Another book that I read for another vlog is The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This I read for the TBR Spin. It is a collection of short stories with one novella. I made the mistake of going into this book with some misconceptions. I thought it was queer. It is not queer. I thought it was sci-fi. It is not sci-fi. It is just general fiction, short stories, kind of all revolving about female main characters, women main characters, and how they got to where they are in their lives and what they're doing or what they're not doing to change their position in life. So some of these women in these stories are striving to change their lives, to change things. Some of these women are kind of stuck where they are, making do with what they have. Some of these women are a little of both. The main titular novella, The Office of Historical Corrections, is specifically about a woman who takes a job at what is colloquially called the Office of Historical Corrections, and it's basically a government-funded branch that goes out and corrects mistakes that are explicitly stated on like brochures or monuments or things like that. So she was a teacher, and then she's kind of trying to take on this job that is more meaningful to her and has more to do with making the world a better place in her eyes. So she is a person who is not necessarily stuck where she is, but she is kind of striving to change her atmosphere and her environment where she is. She's happy in her relationship. Her relationship is fine. She's kind of actively working to change that in some ways. Maybe, possibly not for the better. So a lot of these stories are like that. This book definitely reminded me of Lot by Brian Washington, which I read earlier this year, in that it's just small stories of people's lives that you may see kind of a longer story arc, or you may see a very short snippet of. I thought all of these were really, really well done though. I really enjoyed reading them, and I thought that they all felt very fully formed, right? That's something that I've been talking about a lot with short stories this year, and the idea that they... Oh, If I Survive You is the other one that this made me think of a little bit. That they all felt like complete short stories, not just like snippets of things that people were working on and then threw together into a short story. Like, I feel like each one of these was well crafted, which I really like in short stories. It's fine to have short story collections where it's just some of the author's work thrown together, but I prefer when each short story is well crafted and complete. Not that they're necessarily a complete story arc, or not that they're necessarily a story with a final ending or a conclusion, but that the story itself, the craft of the story, was well worked on. So I would definitely highly recommend this one. Just know going in that it's contemporary, it's literary fiction, it's not speculative or genre in any way. The next book that I completed in September was Fun Home, a family tragic comic by Alison Bechdel. Alison Bechdel is very famous for her nonfiction graphic novels, but I have never actually read any of her work, so I was super excited to get to this one. I've had this one on my TBR for a little while, and the reason that I got to it was that it was included in the 100 Best Books of the 20th Century So Far New York Times article, which I am also kind of including in a vlog, so you will hear more of my thoughts on this there as well. But this is a autobiographical memoir style graphic novel of Alison's time growing up and her relationship with her father. Her relationship with her father was both very close and also very strained in a lot of ways. Her relationship with her family was very strained in a lot of ways altogether, and this kind of goes over how later in life Alison came out as a lesbian to her family, and at that time she also found out that her dad was queer as well, and some other revelations about her childhood and about her family and about the relationship between her father and mother. So this one was really interesting. I think it's a little bit misleading in that it's billed as being about her time growing up in a funeral home, and it really isn't about that. Her family does run a funeral home, and her father does work in the funeral home alongside being a professor. But this book is not about that. There's a couple of passages where she's in the funeral home. It's really more about Alison dissecting her feelings about her father, about outing herself and his outing, and then also about his death when she was in her 20s. It was really interesting. It was really good. It definitely is a little bit pretentious. It definitely has a lot to do with like literature and intellectualism and design, and it often feels like Alison is talking down not only to the reader, but kind of to the world in general in certain respects, but not necessarily in a bad way. I'm not like a huge fan of her art, which is one of the things that stopped me. Oh, that's a nude lady. Don't look at that. Which is one of the things that stopped me from reading it initially, I think, because it isn't super dynamic necessarily, but I did end up really enjoying it and thinking that it worked well for what it was. So if you're interested in graphic memoirs, I would definitely give this one a try. The next book that I read, I got free with one of my subscriptions, and it is Lovers at the Museum by Isabel Allende. So this is the first Allende I've ever read. My best friend's favorite book of all time is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, and I have that one, and sometimes I'm interested to read it, but it's a multi-generational family saga. It's a super long book, and that is just not my kind of book. I just don't really like multi-generational family sagas. One day, maybe I will read it, but I was super excited to get to this extremely short story about a couple who is discovered entangled in a museum in Spain. So we start the story and there are these two people who are found obviously having made love in the museum at night, and it's all about the inspector who comes to look at this case and find out what happened, how they got into the museum, and what led them to this place. And that's the whole story, and I'm not going to go into it any more than that because it is only like 40 minutes long. So it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you have this service and you can get it for free. I read this book on audio and I really enjoyed it. It's super quick, so you have to pay attention. I did end up going back to the last like 5 minutes and re-listening to that to like make sure I understood all of the story, because one of the things that happens to me with very short stories sometimes is that I'm doing other things, and if you miss one little piece of an extremely short story, then you miss like a big chunk of what happened. I didn't miss it, I just needed to go back and clarify it again. I really like this one. It had some interesting aspects. It had great character development for such a short story. It had an interesting idea and premise. It had some surprises in it and some interesting things, so I would definitely highly recommend Lovers at the Museum. This book was originally written in Spanish. Allende often writes things originally in Spanish, but it was translated by the author. The next book that I read in September was a reread, and this was another short story from that subscription. And this is actually the first story I've gone back and reread. About a year ago, I read Falling Bodies by Rebecca Roanhorse for the first time. I immediately loved it, and this, I have often said, is one of the reasons that I keep reading these short stories, because it is so well formed, it is so character driven, it is so plot heavy, it is so atmospheric, there's so much world building in, you know, an hour and 20 minutes or whatever it is, and it's like absolutely amazing that you could have such a complete and moving story in that amount of time. Falling Bodies follows our main character, Ira, who is going to a space station. He has been given a second chance. He's changed his appearance. He's going to this space station to enroll in school, and he's really excited when we first meet him to get a stab at like a normal life. And it turns out that Ira, our main character, was adopted by the colonizing people of Earth, kind of as an experiment that the Earth people, the savage people, could be humanized, for lack of a better word. So his father is a senator and he adopted him. They've lived their whole lives together, and the senator is the only family that Ira knows, but he is from a different species, he is from a different people, he is from a colonizing force, and so this brings up a lot of mixed feelings in Ira, a lot of mixed feelings for the world at large and the different views of the colonizers and the colonized people. So this one's super short, really interesting. I would definitely highly recommend picking this one up. I definitely cried the first time I read it, and I teared up again the second time I read it. It's amazing. Like I said, that such a short book could have such an emotional punch. You should just read this one. This is one of the best of these short stories that I have read so far. One of the reasons that I'm reading a lot of these short stories this month is partly for Shorty September, but partly because I want to do another tier ranking. I won't be tier ranking Falling Bodies again because it appeared in my first tier rank, but you can go and check out that video if you want to see what other of those short stories I've really liked. The next book that I read in September is Weather by Jenny Awful. I read this also for that Savage Prompt vlog, so you can see more of my thoughts in that vlog. This book I've had for a while, and I've heard only good things about Jenny Awful's work in general. She writes contemporary works with these very short vignette style. Weather also has like a little bit of mixed media, not exactly, but our main character, who I don't remember her name, Lizzie, our main character Lizzie is a teacher, but she works on the side for sort of like author, celebrity, environmentalist kind of person who receives a lot of mail and receives a lot of letters, and so she hires Lizzie to look through those letters, and a lot of the mixed media aspect is the letters that Lizzie is answering or that she is reading and how that's intertwined with her life and her feeling. And then as she's learning more about climate change and as she's learning more about everything that's that's going on in the world, she is getting more and more climate anxiety, more and more anxiety about the future of the world in general. This is set right around the elections in the US that kind of changed the trajectory of the US in the last few years. This book was written in 2020, but I think it takes place like closer to the previous election, so like 2016, and told in these teeny tiny vignettes, and her anxiety about climate change, the weather, and different things like that, but specifically as it relates to her and her family. So she has a husband and a small child, and it just follows her life for a couple of weeks and the relationships that she has. It was really interesting. I enjoyed it, but I was not as like emotionally attached to this one. I love books that are told in vignettes. I love vignette stories, but I wonder if a lot of times it is hard to get emotionally attached to the people in those stories because of the vignettes. I don't know why that would be, because it's basically just a whole story told in these like very short little chapters, right? So it should have basically the same emotional experience as something like this. But I definitely have found with some of the vignette books that I've read this year that that is not the case. So I'm thinking of Weather, I'm thinking of Buddha in the Attic, I'm thinking of Clear. All those books were told in vignette styles. All of them I enjoyed, some more than others. Clear was excellent. They do keep you at a strange distance from the characters and from feeling attached to them. I read Weather on audio and I did enjoy it. That might have also though been one of the reasons that I felt detached from it. I also read Buddha in the Attic on audio and I felt the same way about that. Like maybe if I had to read this physically and sit down and be absorbed by it in that way, I wouldn't have that feeling. I'm not sure. Let me know if you've read Weather. It's a weird one because nothing really happens and it's very lit-ficky in my mind and almost like forgettable, but also somehow I feel like there's nuggets in here that I miss that it would be a good book to discuss with people. Let me know your thoughts. The next book that I've finished so far in September is Death's a Beach by Beth Sherman. This is the third book in a Jersey Shore mystery series. These books all follow Anne Hardaway, who lives in Oceanside Heights, New Jersey, which is actually Ocean Grove, New Jersey, which is the town directly south of where I live. So Lansdale in these books is Asbury Park. These books were written in the late 90s. This book was written in 2000, or at least published in 2000, and they follow Anne in like the early 90s. She is a ghostwriter, so she lives in her family home in Oceanside Heights, which is like a really quiet beach town. It's known as God's Own Mile, according to these books, God's Square Mile in real life. She lives in this kind of like ramshackle old home, and things happen to her as she's ghostwriting these books. Like in the first book, a man washes up at the beach and she becomes embroiled in the mystery and she helps solve the mystery. She's friends with some of the townspeople, but because her mother had Alzheimer's towards the end of her life and became very erratic, the townspeople also kind of steer clear from Anne. So this gives her like a kind of a unique perspective and place in the town where she can observe and see things, and she knows a lot about all these people, but she is held a little bit at arm's length. Throughout these books, she also makes friends with a police detective, and she becomes involved with a man who is involved in the first book, whose brother was the man who turned up murdered. Jack is her long-term boyfriend and plays a big role in this book. This book sees Anne writing a home improvement story when a huge unexpected nor'easter hits the town, and a lot of the houses and a lot of the town is damaged, including Anne's house. So as she's looking to do repairs and as she's finding out how much damage it sustains, they discover a skeleton in her basement. And this story is all about her finding out who that skeleton was, solving the crime, and how it's tied to her family and to her family home. And then the side story is kind of her relationship with Jack and how she's not sure if she's ready for a full commitment or not. So I really like this one. These books are like very fluffy, very fun. They use a little bit of a cute device where at the beginning of each chapter there's a little passage from the book that Anne is ghostwriting, and the book always kind of ties in with the mystery. Anne is an interesting character. She's older, she's like approaching 40, and she lives alone in this house that she grew up in, and she really appreciates her independence, and she definitely gets herself into a lot of scrapes because of this, but also she doesn't feel resentful of that reason. I thought I guessed the murderer right away. I was like, 2 chapters in, I was like, I know who did it. I know who did it. No. I was completely wrong. I did not know who did it. And only later is it revealed, and it kind of makes sense. These aren't necessarily books, though, that you could solve. They're books that you could guess the explanation, but they're not books that you could solve, which I don't mind. But some people like it when the clues are all there and it's pretty obvious. And I should have remembered that when I guessed that murderer, that these books usually the villain is someone who kind of appears later, if that makes sense. I have the next book in the series, which is super fun, so I will be able to read one more in this series before I have to find some of the other books. It is well into October, and I have not completed my September monthly reading wrap-up. So it's time to talk about the last books that I read in September, and it's time to do a wrap-up of the wrap-up. The next book that I finished in September was We Solve Murders by Richard Osman. I read this like as close to release date as I possibly could. I reserved it at the library on audio, and as soon as I got it, I read it. I really love the Thursday Murder Club, and this is Richard Osman's new cozy mystery series. Now, I call these cozy mysteries, they're not exactly cozy mysteries because they do have a little bit more violence and a little bit more depth, but I do find them super, super cozy. Speaking about the Thursday Murder Club, We Solve Murders was also quite cozy. It was a little bit larger in scope because it takes place all over the world, and it seems like this series is going to do that throughout the entire series. We Solve Murders is about a retired police detective who is living in a small town doing detective work occasionally, but he is very careful, very cautious. He likes his routines. He likes to wear the same clothes. He likes to sit on the same bench. He likes to go to the pub quiz at night. He likes to see the same people. He likes to eat the same things. Although he's a great detective and although he was a great police officer, he is very much settled down in life, kind of to the point where he doesn't want to change. He doesn't want upheaval. He doesn't want things to be different. His daughter-in-law is in private security, so she's kind of the opposite. She has to go around to different people. She has to bodyguard for different people. She's all over the world. She has killed people. She's, gotten into fights. She has to think on her feet. She has to constantly be changing, and luckily her husband doesn't mind this. He is an intellectual and a professor and a researcher, but he lets her do her thing and she lets him do his thing. She has formed a great connection with her father-in-law. They talk almost every day. His life is small and routine, and her life is wild and all over the place. The one big consistency in both their lives is that they talk every day. So those are our two main characters, and then the daughter-in-law is bodyguarding someone, and when things start to go awry and a bigger mystery starts to become at play, we meet our third main character, who is a aging thriller mystery writer who is like a celebrity gal about town. So she is famous for her books. She's been famous for her exploits. She does drugs. She has sex. She, has a wild, rich lifestyle, but she now lives on like a quiet, private island, and she's hired the daughter-in-law through the daughter-in-law's agency to be her bodyguard. So those are the three main characters. That's the basic premise. When a mystery arises, these three characters have to come together to help solve it, and then by the end of the book we know who's going to move on to the rest of the series. The father-in-law, the ex-detective, has a cat named Troubles, and so that's the cat on the cover of the book. This is not sadly, a cat cozy mystery, as I was hoping it would be. But it was super fun. Like the Thursday Murder Club, there's a million characters, it's super convoluted, there's a lot of things going on. You meet allies, you meet enemies, you meet villains, you meet heroes, and who knows which one of those is going to come back to play in future books, but you know that some of them are. Our three main characters are going to have made enemies that are going to come back to haunt them. Our three main characters are going to make friends who come back to help them. Very fast-paced, wordy, very dialogue-heavy, very British humor, just like the Thursday Murder Club. So it's very, very similar to that. I really enjoyed it. I love British humor. I am definitely an Anglophile in that respect. I grew up with it. I find it easy to read. I find it easy to understand. I find the modern references that I either know them through pop culture osmosis or that I get the gist of it. I think one of the problems that people have with these books is they're unfamiliar with British humor and the cadence of British talk, and then also of the references, because he puts in a lot of modern references in his books. But I get it, I like it, I enjoy it. I think that this one, similar to the first Thursday Murder Club book, introduced so many people, so much plot, and so much background that I could see how that in and of itself would be quite confusing, and I can also see how people would not really be able to decipher like all the different moving pieces. Unlike the Thursday Murder Club, I don't think the characterization and the character development was as strong, so I think it was harder to get behind these characters and to come to really like them. But definitely in future books, I think we will learn more about them and we will become closer to especially our three main characters. So I did enjoy it. I will definitely read, I will definitely read more in this series, but I'm also excited to get back to the Thursday Murder Club and for Richard Osman to get back to the Thursday Murder Club. The next book that I read in September is Stag by Karen Russell. This is a very short story that I get free with one of my subscriptions, and this was the last in this particular short story grouping that I had to read. So this grouping had a lot of stories that I really loved. It had a story by Carmen Maria Machado that I loved. It had a story by Stephen Graham Jones that I loved. It had a story by Paul Tremblay that I enjoyed. I didn't really love Stag. Stag is all about a young man who's not as young as people think he is, who's kind of on a little bit of a bender. He meets a young woman and he agrees to be her guest at a wedding. So she doesn't want to go to this wedding alone, so he goes with her, and he's like basically just drinking and having fun. He doesn't even like really remember who this person is or anything about them. He has lied to her. He hasn't told her who he is. And throughout the story, we see his observations of the wedding, which is held in a desert area, and one of the guests of the wedding is a tortoise that the couple owned. Oh, you know what? It's not a wedding, it's a divorce. So it's very similar to a wedding, but it's a divorce. This story takes place in like kind of a future time where divorce parties are as popular as weddings. We see the tortoise that this couple had and like that shared their love bond, and that was like symbolic of it. In the background of this story, it's a commentary on like climate change and fast-paced lifestyle and the current state of the world in this like slightly future, slightly dystopian time period. Like dystopian the way our actual time period is headed, not like super sci-fi. That's the basic premise. I enjoyed it okay. Like, it was fine. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. It was like totally meh. So, but if that sounds interesting to you, I would definitely suggest picking it out. Karen Russell wrote Swamplandia, which is a nonfiction book, I think, about the southern U.S. states and the environment in the southern U.S. states, but honestly, I don't really know. And this story didn't really make me want to find out. The next book that I finished in September is The Suitcase Clone, which is the last book before his current release by Robin Sloan that I have yet to read. Does that make sense? So this year I read Sourdough, I read Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, and I read Ajax Penumbra 1969, which are all in Robin Sloan's Penumbra universe. universe. And the Suitcase Clone is also in that universe. So this story is a historical fiction. It takes place in the past, and we follow a young man who has just come back to the US from being abroad, has just dealt with a breakup, and he's looking for something to kind of take his mind off of it when he meets someone who wants him to go on this mission to go to a vineyard and steal some of their grapevine. This story is all about that man, all about his life, all about this grapevine heist, and it connects Mr. Penumbra and Ajax Penumbra into the universe of Sourdough. So those stories were already connected, but all these stories take place at all different times in history. Ajax Penumbra obviously takes place in 1969. I think Mr. Penumbra takes place in like the early 2010s, Sourdough in the mid 2010s, and then we go back in time for the Suitcase Clone. I have not yet read Robin Sloan's latest book, which came out this year, which takes place far in the future. I have a feeling that all of Robin Sloan's books are going to be connected in some way, but it'll be interesting to see how this like far future book is connected to them. I enjoyed this one. I really like Robin Sloan's writing. I really like the magical realism and magical everydayism, but also the speculative elements of Robin Sloan. The Suitcase Clone was a little hard to follow. I think sometimes Robin Sloan writes in a particular voice that is a little disconcerting. All his books are written in a slightly different style, so some in second person, some in first person, some in past tense, some in present tense. I always find it a little bit of a struggle to get into the story as it's being told, but once I've gotten into it and once I've become comfortable in the way that the story is told, then I end up really liking the story. This one I think was the hardest to get into, but I did enjoy it. The next book that I read in September was In the House in the Dark of the Woods by Laird Hunt. So this one's been on my TBR for a long time. I picked this up at a used bookstore in Brooklyn in 2023, and I have been wanting to get to it since I found out about it on BookTube several years ago. It's such a cute book. It's such a beautiful cover. I heard it was like a dark gothic horror fantasy, right? This story is much more puritanical and much more historical fiction than I thought it was going to be. And those are two things that I don't really love. I like recent historical fiction, like The Suitcase Clone. I like things that take place in the recent past and would be considered historical fiction. I don't love things that take place in like the 1600s. I don't love stuff that takes place in like the 1200s. I don't even really like stuff that takes place in the 1800s, whether it was written in that time or whether it's a historical fiction about that time. And this follows a woman who is in the woods picking berries for her family, and as she's in the woods talking about her family, we learn about like all the stuff that she does for her husband and son and how her life revolves around them and how she has to be careful that her husband doesn't like beat her, and she does the right thing all the time, and she gives them everything they want, and how women are like nothing in this community, and how, you know, she's not allowed to learn to read or write, and blah, 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 blah. And I just don't like puritanical stories. I don't like books that are set in that time. I don't like fiction that's set in that time. I don't like speculative fiction that's set in that time. It's one of the things that I really, really dislike. I have tried several different books and really couldn't get into them. I read this book on audio, and I think that's one of the reasons that I got through it. I read it on a fast speed, and I just got on with it, you know, got over it and just read it, but I really didn't like this book. I think it was very atmospheric. I think it was confusing and interesting, and part of that confusion is supposed to be what the horror is, that unsettling nature of not really understanding what's going on, but I just couldn't get over the themes, especially written by a man. I don't want to hear about like that puritanical idea and like the feminism of someone like getting out of that idea written by a man, like even though he was trying to do the right thing. I think there's too much underlying like misogyny and too much joy in putting women through the trials and tribulations and abuse that they face at that time when written by a man. If it's written by a woman, I feel like they're trying to say something and they're trying to like express something. If it's written by a man, I think they're secretly like enjoying that aspect of it too much. I would say if you like that kind of writing, if you like Brom, if you liked Year of the Witching, if you like stories about that time, I would definitely give it a shot. It wasn't bad. It was very confusing. It was very convoluted. It was overly dramatic, purple prose, not well explained, but maybe you'll like it. It's just that I didn't really like it, which is sad because I love this book. It's so beautiful. The next book that I finished in September was Ariel by Sylvia Plath. This is a collection of poems. This is actually her last collection of poems before her death by suicide. So I was reading this because I've never read any Sylvia Plath, and I found this amazing copy. Like, how beautiful is this? It's a little hardcover. It's so cute. But I also saw Sean from Past Storytime reading this, and one of the prompts for Shorty September was to read a book that you saw in the wild. So that could be in real life, in everyday life, or it could be on BookTube, and I wanted to complete this for that prompt. So I read this slowly over the month. I read poetry collections slowly, usually, so that I really can sit with each poem and can go back over poems. And the way I usually read poetry collections is to read a few, skip around, read short ones, read ones that grab my attention, stop for a little while, go back, maybe reread some of those poems, and then go on and read more. And it tends to be that the longest poems are the last ones that I read. I really like this poetry. It is the kind of poetry that I don't like as much. So this is very nebulous, metaphoric, obscure poetry is what I would call this. Like, she's talking about things that are intangible. She's talking about things that don't make sense. Word salad kind of poetry. Except, obviously, there is a goal, there is a story in there. It's just that as the reader, and I'm not a great reader of poetry, obviously, as the reader, it's not necessarily decipherable exactly what the story is or exactly what the poems are about. They're non-linear. They're non-narrative. They are confusing. They are weird. Something about this poetry just clicks. Something about her writing is astonishing. Something about it is communicative. Something about it makes sense, even if you don't really understand what the poem is about. And it is very obvious from my first time reading any of Sylvia Plath why she is so renowned, why she is so revered, why people find connection with her so easily, and what a brilliant writer she was. So I'm excited to read more Sylvia Plath in general, and I'm definitely excited to read more of her poetry. I did tab quite a bit at the bottom, and my favorite poems were about beekeeping and about her miscarriage. There was a lot in here that, although it wasn't directly about those things, made sense. Like, for instance, I didn't know anything about Sylvia Plath's life except that she was married to maybe a not very nice man and she eventually committed suicide. Through reading these poems, even though they weren't explicitly stating that fact, I could tell that she had lost a child, and I could tell that that had a huge impact on her life. I could glean something about her depression, and I could feel her love and excitement for her beekeeping. The beekeeping poems are a little bit more obvious and a little bit more straightforward, some of them, but some of them, her love of it is kind of intertwined. Super happy to have read this. I thought it was excellent. I would highly suggest starting here with Sylvia Plath, as I did, although I have nothing else to base it on except the fact that I started here. I really loved it, and I'm glad to have read it. The next book that I read in September was the last book that I read in September, and that was His Happy Place, which is another one of those short stories, and this was by Zekiah Dahlia Harris, who is most famous for writing the thriller The Other Black Girl, which I do have on my shelf. So I've never read anything by this author before, and I love these short stories because it is a good way to taste test authors and to taste test writing styles. But I really didn't like this one either. September was a mixed bag because there was quite a few books that I didn't enjoy or didn't feel connected with, and then there was a lot of books that I really, really loved. His Happy Place is about a young woman who has a boyfriend, and he takes her to his cabin, his happy place, for the first time in their relationship. Obviously, there are things going on, because this has got a horror bent, because this has a suspense bent, because this has a thriller bent, you know that things are going to take a turn. And that's basically the whole premise of this book, and also basically all I remember about this book. There was something about the main character's like fear of commitment and her past, and maybe there was a supernatural element to it. I honestly don't really remember. I thought this was pretty bland, pretty boring, not very interesting, not very innovative or exciting ideas. And that's an unfortunate way to end the month for sure, but that is where I ended the month. So if you read The Other Black Girl or anything else by her, I would definitely suggest picking this one up. If you're interested in isolated cabin in the woods stories, this one didn't do anything exciting or new, but why not read it? It's fine. You know, these stories are like 45 minutes to an hour and a half, so they're easy to digest, easy to get through, especially on audio, so I would suggest picking them up. Unfortunately, I had two flops this month regarding those short stories, regarding those collections, but I also read quite a few that I really enjoyed. I reread one that I really enjoyed. I enjoyed one from an author that I've read from before, Veronica Roth, other authors that I've liked before as well. I read one translated work this month. I read a graphic novel, which is very, very rare for me. I definitely read some books that I didn't love, but I got them off the TBR, which is good. But and look at how cute they are. Oh, it's such a shame. I love them so much. The books, but not the books, you know? I read one in a cozy mystery series that I like. I read, I guess this is also a graphic novel, but a travel log. I read some poetry, which was interesting. I read some books that have been on my TBR for a while that I really wanted to read. I read works by people of color. I read just a teeny tiny bit of queer work. It was overall a really great reading month. I read 22 books this month, which is a lot of books, and I definitely have Shorty September to thank for that, because I think Shorty September gave me the impetus to read a lot of short stories, a lot of novellas, a lot of really short vignette books that I've been wanting to read. Super glad to have participated again this year, and can't wait till next year, of course. Also, I'm looking forward to Novella November, which is coming up, because that is another readathon reading month that I love. Let me know what you read in the month of September. Let me know if you read any of the books that I read here and what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!